Imagine you are an American soldier. It is the spring of 1945. You have just fought your way through France, Belgium, and across the Rhine. You have seen things that you will never be able to unsee. Now you are standing in a German town, Weimar, Dachau, Nordhausen, Buchenwald. It doesn't matter which one. What you are about to find will change you forever. Just beyond the edge of the perfectly normal-looking town, with its church spire, its bakery, its school, there is a camp. And inside that camp, tens of thousands of human beings have been murdered, starved, worked to death, gassed, burned. And the townspeople will tell you, every last one of them, that they had no idea. Wir haben nichts gewusst. We knew nothing. This video is about that claim. About whether it was true. About the psychology, the sociology, the deliberate architecture of ignorance, and about what Allied soldiers and investigators actually found when they started asking questions. Because the answer is far more complicated, and far more disturbing, than a simple yes or no. Let us begin with the most important thing we need to understand. The Nazi state was genuinely, deliberately, and systematically secretive about its worst crimes. The final solution, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, was not announced in the newspaper. It was not broadcast on the radio. The word extermination was often replaced in official communications with euphemisms, special treatment, resettlement, the final solution to the Jewish question. The death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, were built primarily in occupied Poland, far from German soil. This was not an accident. The architects of the Holocaust understood that putting the industrialized killing at a geographic distance would help maintain a degree of plausible deniability back home. When the deportation trains left German cities packed with Jewish families, the official story was resettlement in the East. Labor camps. New communities. The Nazi government actively cultivated this fiction. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and the man most directly responsible for implementing the Holocaust, gave a speech in 1943 to senior SS officers in Poznan. In it he said explicitly, and I am paraphrasing here, that this was a page of glory in German history that had never been written and never would be written. He was speaking to the men who actually ran the camps. Even within the Nazi hierarchy, the mass murder was treated as a secret. But here is where it becomes more complicated. Keeping secrets in a totalitarian state is not just about hiding information from outsiders. It is about creating an environment where asking questions, seeking information, or even acknowledging what you suspect is dangerous. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, had informants seemingly everywhere. Neighbors reported neighbors. Co-workers reported co-workers. Even children were encouraged to report on their parents. In this environment, expressing doubt about the official story, or asking too many questions about where the Jews had gone, could itself be a fatal mistake. So even Germans who suspected something was wrong, who heard rumors, who noticed that their Jewish neighbors had simply vanished, had powerful incentives to keep those suspicions to themselves. Not just to lie to others, but in many cases, to stop themselves from thinking about it at all. This is what historians call motivated ignorance. You know enough to be uncomfortable, but you also know that knowing more or saying more is dangerous. So you don't ask. You don't look. You cultivate your own not knowing. This phenomenon is not unique to Nazi Germany. It appears in genocides and atrocities across history. But the Nazi state had perfected the mechanisms that made it uniquely effective. And yet, and this is where the "we knew nothing" claim begins to fall apart, the secrets were never perfectly kept. German soldiers served on the Eastern Front. They witnessed mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that murdered approximately 1.5 million Jews in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states before the death camps were even fully operational. These soldiers came home on leave. They talked. Not always explicitly, but they talked. Letters were written home from the front, some of which survived and have been studied by historians like Christopher Browning and others. Many of these letters contain descriptions, hints, or outright accounts of mass killings of Jewish civilians. The SD, the Nazi intelligence service, ran regular reports on German public opinion called Meldungen aus dem Reich, reports from the Reich. These reports from the early 1940s show that rumors about the mass murder of Jews were circulating widely through German society. People were talking about it at market stalls, in churches, in factory break rooms. These reports concerned Nazi leadership precisely because the rumors were so widespread. The genocide was an open secret, not fully known, not officially acknowledged, but whispered about, suspected, discussed in hushed tones across the length and breadth of Germany. Now let us go to the soldiers themselves. Because what they discovered when they entered these camps was not abstract. It was not statistical. It was visceral, immediate, and shattering. Dachau was the first concentration camp established by the Nazis, opened in 1933 just a few miles outside of Munich. It was not, technically, an extermination camp. The mass gassing facilities were never fully operational there, but by the time American troops from the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Rainbow Division arrived on April 29, 1945, they found approximately 30,000 survivors in conditions of almost unimaginable horror. They found a train on the tracks outside the camp. 39 boxcars. Inside those boxcars were approximately 2,000 bodies. Men, women, children, stacked like cordwood, dead from starvation, disease, and exposure during transport from other camps. Inside the camp walls, American soldiers found mass graves. They found the crematorium ovens, still containing human remains. They found thousands of living survivors so emaciated that some of them weighed 70, 80 pounds, adults who looked like skeletons with skin stretched over them. The soldiers' own accounts describe the experience as something that broke something inside them. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, visited several camps and wrote in a letter to General George Marshall that what he saw defied description. He deliberately invited politicians, journalists, and delegations from around the world to witness the camps before the evidence could be erased, because he said he wanted there to be no doubt in the world about what had happened. But perhaps the most stark collision between "we knew nothing" and the physical reality came at Buchenwald, located on a hill just outside the city of Weimar, the cultural capital of Germany, the city of Goethe, of Schiller, of the ideals of German humanism. When American troops from the 6th Armored Division liberated Buchenwald on April 11, 1945, they found over 21,000 survivors. They found thousands of bodies. They found the evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. And they found something else. Weimar was right there. The smoke from the crematorium had drifted over the city for years. The smell, which survivors and soldiers alike described as unmistakable, had been present in the air. The camp had used civilian contractors, German workers, to help build and maintain its facilities. Goods produced by camp prisoners had passed through the local economy. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army, was furious. He ordered the mayor of Weimar and a delegation of German civilians to be marched up the hill to Buchenwald and forced to walk through the camp. To see it. To smell it. To look at what had been done. The mayor, a man named Dr. Schroeder, returned home that evening and hanged himself along with his wife. Whether this was an act of guilt, of shame, or simply of a man who now understood the scale of what his city, his country, had done and could not live with that knowledge, we cannot say for certain. But it suggests that the claim of total ignorance was, for at least some, impossible to maintain when confronted with a physical reality. On April 11th, the same day as Buchenwald's liberation, soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division entered the Dora-Mittelbau camp near Nordhausen in central Germany. Here was a different kind of horror, a camp where prisoners had been worked to death building V-2 rockets in underground tunnels. The rockets built at Dora by slave laborers were the ones that rained down on London and Antwerp. Approximately 20,000 people died at Dora, more than died from the rockets themselves. What soldiers found at Nordhausen was one of the most catastrophic single scenes of the entire liberation. The SS had evacuated the camp in haste and left behind approximately 3,000 dead and dying prisoners in the open air, many of them from a typhus epidemic that had been deliberately allowed to run unchecked. And Nordhausen was a city, a German city, with the camp sitting on its outskirts. The tunnels were visible. The prisoners had marched through the streets. Everyone in Nordhausen had seen them. What is striking, and what historians have documented carefully, is that this pattern repeated across virtually every camp liberation. The camp was always near a town. The town residents always claimed total ignorance. And yet the physical evidence, the smoke, the smell, the sight of prisoners, the involvement of local labor, the use of local services and infrastructure, made total ignorance essentially impossible. This does not mean everyone knew everything. It does not mean the average German civilian understood the full scope or the systematic nature of what was happening. But it does mean that the categorical denial, "we knew nothing, we saw nothing, we had no idea," cannot be taken at face value. So if many Germans suspected or even knew something was wrong, why did so many insist afterward that they had known nothing? And why, during the war itself, did so many choose not to look more closely? The concept that psychologists and historians use most often here is willful blindness, sometimes also called motivated ignorance or strategic non-knowledge. It describes a condition where a person has access to information that will be disturbing, but actively avoids seeking or processing that information because the implications are too uncomfortable, too dangerous, or too threatening to their sense of self and world. This is not simple lying, though lying is certainly part of it. Willful blindness operates at a deeper level. People genuinely come to believe that they did not know, because they trained themselves not to know. They created internal barriers against information that would require them to act, resist, or confront the unbearable. We also cannot understand this phenomenon without understanding the extraordinary power of Nazi propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. The German population had been subjected, from 1933 onward, to one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in human history. Jews were systematically dehumanized in the press, in films, in school curricula, in art, and in everyday public life. By the time the deportations began in earnest in the early 1940s, much of the German public had been conditioned to see Jews as something less than fully human, a danger to Germany, a problem to be solved, a category of person to whom normal moral rules might not apply. This dehumanization is a necessary precondition for genocide. And it meant that when rumors circulated about what was happening to the Jews in the East, many Germans were psychologically prepared to not care, or to feel that, whatever was happening, it was probably justified. That is different from not knowing. It is, in some ways, worse. There is another psychological dimension that historians and social scientists have examined: conformity. In a totalitarian society, expressing dissent is not merely uncomfortable, it is potentially fatal. And so most people do not dissent. They go along. They repeat the official story. They perform loyalty to the regime, even if privately they have doubts. And here is the disturbing thing about conformity. When everyone around you is performing the same ignorance, the same loyalty, the same acceptance of the official narrative, it becomes genuinely difficult to maintain your own independent perception of reality. The social pressure to conform is not just external. It reshapes how people actually think and perceive. Hannah Arendt famously wrote about the banality of evil. Her observation that many perpetrators of the Holocaust were not monsters or fanatics, but ordinary, bureaucratic people doing their jobs in an ordinary way. The same logic applies to bystanders. Many of the German civilians who claimed to know nothing were not, individually, evil people. They were people who had been systematically conditioned, through fear and propaganda and social pressure, to not know. But we should also listen to another voice in this story, the survivors themselves. Because survivors consistently describe experiences that directly contradict the "we knew nothing" narrative. They describe being marched through German towns, visible to everyone, in striped prisoner uniforms, emaciated, guarded by SS. They describe German townspeople watching from the sidewalks. Some looked away. Some showed pity, occasionally a piece of bread thrown to a prisoner, at enormous personal risk. Some showed contempt or jeered. They describe being used as labor in German factories, on German farms, in German homes. They describe having direct contact with German civilians who did not, fail to see what they were. Elie Wiesel, in his memoir Night, describes the death march from Auschwitz to Gleiwitz and then by open cattle car through Germany, passing through German towns, visible to civilians on railway platforms who watched the human skeletons go by. The survivors saw the Germans seeing them. In the weeks and months following liberation, Allied military investigators, war crimes teams, and intelligence officers conducted thousands of interviews with German civilians and lower-level participants. What they found was a complicated picture that defied easy categorization. Some Germans genuinely knew very little about the death camp specifically, particularly those living far from any camp, with no family members who served in the East, and who had limited exposure to the rumor networks. These cases of genuine ignorance were real, if perhaps rarer than claimed. But investigators also found consistent patterns of deliberate evasion, minimization, and what one American investigator called the convenient forgetting of inconvenient truths. People who had worked in camp administration described themselves as mere functionaries following orders. People who had lived near camps described the smoke and smell in ways that made it impossible to believe they had truly not wondered what caused it. The Nuremberg trials, the landmark war crimes tribunal that began in November 1945, confronted this question directly. The defendants, the senior leadership of the Third Reich, attempted various defenses. They were following orders, they did not know the full scope, they were responsible for their area only and not aware of the whole. The tribunal rejected these defenses systematically. Superior orders, it ruled, was not a valid defense for crimes against humanity. Individual conscience and individual responsibility were recognized in law for the first time in a binding international forum. But the trials also revealed, through documentary evidence, the extraordinary extent to which the murder of European Jews had been organized, documented, bureaucratized, and distributed throughout the German state apparatus. This was not a secret operation run by a handful of fanatical outsiders. It involved hundreds of thousands of German functionaries, soldiers, railway workers, administrators, doctors, lawyers, and ordinary citizens. Decades after the war, historians began systematically examining the question of German civilian knowledge using new methodologies: archival research, oral history, analysis of the Nazi regime's own internal documents. Robert Gellatley's landmark book, Backing Hitler, published in 2001, argued that the Nazi regime's persecution of Jews and others was far more public than previously acknowledged. He examined newspaper coverage, public court proceedings, and other openly available sources from inside Nazi Germany, and argued that any attentive reader of German newspapers in the 1930s and 1940s could have known that Jews were being subjected to violent persecution and deportation. Peter Longrich's research on What Germans Knew concluded that while the full systematic nature of the Holocaust may not have been universally understood, widespread knowledge that Jews were being killed, not merely deported or imprisoned, but killed, was present across broad swaths of German society by 1942 and 1943. Daniel Jonah Goldhagen's controversial 1996 book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, took the most extreme position, arguing that most ordinary Germans were not merely passive bystanders but active participants in or enthusiastic supporters of Jewish persecution. Goldhagen's thesis remains contested among historians, but it forced a reckoning with the degree to which anti-Semitism had been genuinely internalized across German society. In the immediate post-war period, American occupation authorities conducted extensive surveys of German opinion, the Office of Military Government, United States Surveys. These surveys asked Germans, among other things, about their attitudes toward Jews, their knowledge of the camps, and their feelings of personal responsibility for what had happened. The results were sobering. In 1946, when asked directly about the treatment of Jews, significant proportions of German respondents expressed ongoing anti-Semitic attitudes. Many expressed not guilt but resentment, resentment of the occupation, resentment of the war's outcome, resentment of being made to feel responsible for crimes they insisted they had not committed. Denazification, the Allied program designed to remove Nazi influence from German institutions and attitudes, was widely considered by the late 1940s to have largely failed. The post-war German population's engagement with collective guilt was shallow, performative, and often quickly abandoned. It would take decades, multiple generations, before a more genuine reckoning began in West German culture and education. A reckoning that continues to this day. One of the most consequential decisions made in the aftermath of liberation was Eisenhower's insistence on documentation. He understood with striking foresight that there would be those in future generations who denied what had happened, who would say it was propaganda, exaggeration, or outright fabrication. He ordered the camps to be filmed, photographed, and documented in exhaustive detail before anything was moved or cleaned. He brought in journalists, politicians from Britain and the United States, and official delegations to witness the evidence firsthand. The footage shot at camps including Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and others became foundational historical evidence, and is still used in Holocaust education today. And then there were the forced marches. In multiple locations, American, British, and other Allied commanders made the decision to bring German civilians from nearby towns into the camps and compel them to witness what had been done. At Buchenwald, over 1,000 Weimar citizens were marched up the hill. At Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany, liberated by British forces on April 15, 1945, and containing approximately 60,000 survivors and 13,000 unburied bodies, civilians from the surrounding area were brought in. The filmed reactions of these civilians have been studied extensively. Some appeared genuinely shocked. Some wept. Some covered their faces. Some maintained expressions of rigid blankness that could have been shock, shame, or a continued refusal to fully process what they were seeing. And some, a minority, but present in the footage, showed what appeared to be irritation, inconvenience, resentment at being made to look. This variety of reactions is, in its way, more revealing than any uniform response would have been. It showed a spectrum of individual engagement with guilt, knowledge, and responsibility, the full range of human response to an unbearable truth about one's own society. There is a photograph taken at a camp liberation, I will not specify which one, that has become one of the most studied images in Holocaust historiography. It shows a group of German civilians being led through the camp. And in the middle of this group, surrounded by the evidence of mass murder, there is a woman. Her expression is complicated. It is the expression of someone who is performing not knowing, right there in front of the evidence that makes not knowing impossible. It is the expression of a person caught between what they are seeing and what they have allowed themselves to understand. That expression, that complicated, fractured, caught expression, is perhaps the most honest record we have of what we knew nothing actually looked like from the inside. For many years after the war, Germany was largely silent about the Holocaust. The immediate post-war period was consumed by survival, rebuilding, feeding people, managing refugees. The early Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, had every political incentive to integrate former Nazis into its institutions rather than prosecute them, because many of the people who had the skills and experience to run a modern state had been involved, to one degree or another, in the Nazi system. So there was a long silence. Families did not speak of it. Children did not ask their parents. Perpetrators lived out their lives as ordinary citizens. The economic miracle of West German prosperity in the 1950s provided a forward-looking narrative that allowed the past to remain past. This silence was broken, slowly and painfully, over the following decades. The Eichmann trial in 1961, where Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the deportation program, was tried in Jerusalem, brought the Holocaust back into public consciousness. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the early 1960s prosecuted ordinary camp guards and forced a public reckoning with what just following orders had actually meant in practice. The generation that came of age in West Germany in the late 1960s, the children of the war generation, began asking questions their parents had refused to ask. This produced a painful, fractured confrontation within German families and German society. Children asked their parents, "What did you do? What did you know? Were you members of the party? Did you see what was happening to the Jews?" The answers, when they came, were rarely satisfying. Parents retreated to the "we knew nothing" defense, or claimed they had been powerless, or emphasized their own suffering during the Allied bombing campaigns and the brutal final months of the war. The tension between these two generations, the generation of perpetrators and bystanders, and the generation of questioners, shaped West German culture profoundly and produced some of the most remarkable works of literature, film, and philosophy to grapple with collective guilt in the 20th century. Today, Germany has one of the most comprehensive Holocaust education programs in the world. Denial of the Holocaust is a criminal offense. Memorials to the murdered Jews of Europe stand in the center of Berlin. Schools take children to the concentration camp sites as a mandatory part of their education. This represents an extraordinary collective decision, made over generations, to remember, to acknowledge, and to refuse the comfort of "we knew nothing." It has not been uniform. There have been political debates, controversies, and ongoing arguments about how to remember and how to teach. Germany continues to struggle with the question of how many generations must bear the burden of this history. But the fact that this reckoning happened, that it continues to happen, is itself a form of testimony. It is an acknowledgement that "we knew nothing" was never adequate. That something was known. That something was seen. And that what was seen demanded a response that, for too many and for too long, never came. So why does this matter now? Why does it matter whether German civilians in 1945 really knew what was happening? It matters because the mechanisms that allowed the Holocaust to happen, the propaganda, the dehumanization, the willful blindness, the conformity, the motivated ignorance, are not unique to Nazi Germany. They are human mechanisms. They appear wherever atrocity occurs. The "we knew nothing" claim is not a German claim. It is a human claim. It has been made after every genocide, after every mass atrocity, after every collective crime. It will be made again. Understanding how it works, understanding the psychology of not knowing, the architecture of ignorance, the social mechanisms that make bystanders out of otherwise decent people, is not an academic exercise. It is a survival skill. It is the kind of understanding that helps us recognize, in ourselves and our societies, the early signs of the same processes. The soldiers who walked into Dachau and Buchenwald and Nordhausen and Bergen-Belsen were changed forever. Many of them could not speak about what they had seen for decades afterward. Many of them went to their graves carrying those images. But they made sure it was documented. They made sure it was witnessed. They made sure that "we knew nothing" could never be the whole story, because they had been there, and they knew exactly what there was to know. We owe it to them, and to the millions who died, to know it too. Thanks for watching.